Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk to Amin Lessan. You're most welcome, sir. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me, Paul.
Absolute pleasure to have you here today. And Amin is a fourth-year PhD student at UCL, otherwise known as University College London, which is consistently ranked as one of the top 10 universities in the world. He's studying AI-enabled healthcare, specifically focusing on applying AI methods in the context of brain cancer to help develop more personalized treatment for patients. His master's was in data science and machine learning, also at UCL, where he learned quantitative programming methods to examine data. His bachelor's was in computer science at the University of Bristol. Now, he's interested in the miraculous nature of the Qur'an from a variety of perspectives, including but not limited to its remarkable mathematically precise patterns. But he's interested in this in a much more nuanced and measured way. Some claims have gone arguably over the top and potentially discredited the whole idea of remarkable mathematical phenomena in the Quran. So Amin today is going to address this with a presentation. So over to you, sir.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks for inviting me. I feel quite humbled to be on here. So you've given a really great introduction. I think that kind of encapsulates my own introduction quite well. But as I've shown in the title here, I'm going to be introducing the idea of mathematical miracles in the Quran. And I've added here a measured approach, which the pun wasn't intended, but the idea was to make sure that we're not overreaching in this field. So just as a disclaimer, I haven't discovered any significant mathematical miracles in the Quran itself. But what I've done in this presentation today, and I hope to communicate, is that everything I show is something that I've recapitulated myself using my own programming skills, Excel skills, and in some segments I even show proof of that. So the idea is to restore a sense of transparency and trust in this study of the Quran. So that kind of leads into this introductory slide. So why should we look at the Quran from a mathematical perspective at all? Well, the study of the beauty of the Quran is quite multifaceted, and it's got many remarkable aspects to it, countless remarkable aspects to it in a myriad of domains. So linguistics, history, biology, astronomy, human psychology, and more. People from different expertises will find something uniquely remarkable to them in the Quran. So I say, why not mathematics? The Quran is the word of God. We believe that as Muslims, and this is the same God who invented mathematics and imbued it into our everyday surroundings, into nature, into the fabric of reality itself. So I don't think it's odd to want to examine whether any such signature exists in the Quran. And moreover, the Quran itself mentions explicitly certain numbers and mathematical concepts as well that may be an allusion to it, inviting some exploration from that perspective.
Yeah.
And also, there are all these miracles in the Quran, and each will cater to a different type of person. And, to people like myself, the mathematical ones may be especially interesting, maybe less so to other people, but I just think it's good to cover all bases. Now, as I was researching this, because this was just a hobby of mine, but as I was researching it, I found out that there is some surprising controversy around this way of examining the Quran. And first and foremost, just to put some of these caveats forward, the Quran is not a book of mathematics. It's not a book of science. It's not a book of history. It's not a book of linguistics. First and foremost, the primary purpose of the Quran is a book of purpose, a book of divine instruction for humanity. And it outlines the goal of what it means to be human, why we are alive, i.e. to worship God, follow his guidelines through his prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, and to enter paradise in the life after death, after resurrection, and avoid punishment. So this study is merely to appreciate one of the many remarkable aspects of the Quran's beauty. as I alluded to earlier, and to further attest to its inhuman origin. So the study of the miraculous nature of the Qur'an is not new. I believe it's called Ijaz al-Qur'an, but I'm just hopefully reigniting this perspective on the Qur'an itself. But that being said, there are some big caveats we need to avoid, because there have been some pitfalls that, previous people who've sort of obsessed over the Qur'an from a mathematical angle have fallen into, and we don't want to do that. So, for instance, numerology, we don't want to look into numerology at all in the Qur'an, seeing it from that perspective. I mean, from some aspect, it's even associating partners with God to assume that there's some numbers that are inherently able to grant us powers or, predict future
magical numbers and the occult and things like that.
Yeah, especially the occult, which, they really believe in, like sacred geometry to an unhealthy extent. We don't want to go there. We want to just have this as an appreciation of the Quran, but not something to extrapolate these perhaps occultic practices into. Similarly, we don't want to force mathematical patterns onto the Quran, and I bring an example of this because, as you alluded to at the very introduction, Paul, one of the things that's plagued this study of the Quran that's been done before from a mathematical perspective is that people have reached too far into trying to link some supposed mathematical miracle with the Quran, and some of those reaches are, just quite far out, that someone who encounters the mathematical study of the Quran, and that's the first thing they see, the first miracle they see in this perspective, they will just be dismissive of the entire study. And that was me for majority of my life.
It was me too, because there's some notorious cases out there of people who made extraordinary claims which weren't really grounded in fact at all, and and it helps to discredit the whole idea. But the point of this presentation is to have a much more sober, measured, as you call it, presentation based on your expertise in mathematics and data analysis and so on, which you do as a PhD student, and you've still been able to produce some remarkable phenomena, and that's why it's such a great exercise what you're doing, I think.
Yeah. Just to clarify, I've been able to reproduce things that people have said, so I don't want to take credit for anything here, but I do want to show, as you've said, that this stuff is real. So what I'll present today actually exists. You don't have to. Basically, it's actually there. I'm not lying, and I've even put some of the proof for that. So hopefully, to restore a sense of credibility to the field as a whole, because I think it's a real shame to dismiss the entirety of it, because there are some really remarkable gems in the Quran from a mathematical perspective, as I hope to show just a couple examples today in depth. So just to finish off, we don't want to change the Quran to fit a mathematical model. So this is something that
people have done this, but people actually said, these two verses are not quite right. If you change them this way, then this mathematical miracle that I'm proposing exists. And this is, of course, absolutely outrageous. You can't change the Quran.
Yeah. And I think even that is, in a way, it's counterintuitive, because one of the miracles we believe as Muslims is that the Quran is preserved.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you're sort of cutting off one miracle in order to enforce another one, which is arguably much less real. So really, you're not even gaining anything by doing that. I think it's not good, and just generally reaching too far. So to give an example I want to give a concrete example of this, maybe a bit of a lighthearted note to ease into things. But there's this case study I want to give on overreaching a mathematical miracle, the Quran and the moon landing. And this is an actual example I happened to find, and it's from a website by I think a well-meaning, well-intentioned Muslim blog post, and the rest of this blog is actually, I think, has some useful dawah materials. It seems like a well-intentioned Muslim who wants to show the remarkable nature of the Quran, but I think this particular post that they had written, which I just searched on Google, Quran and moon landing, is this real? I found this, and I think it's an example not only to show that people are overreaching, but to show that potentially well-intentioned people, without any intention of discrediting the Quran or dismissing the study, are going forth and like making these connections, which will inadvertently actually potentially harm people being interested in the Quran in the first place. So just to give you an example of this, some of the things that were mentioned in this supposed mathematical miracle. So the 54th chapter of the Quran is named after the moon, so Surah Al-Qamar. And it mentions the moon in its first verse. So someone was saying, okay, well, there are 1,389 verses after this verse. So from this verse until the very end of the Quran, there's 1,389 verses. Well, it turns out the year 1,389 after Hijrah is the year 1969 if you convert it to our Gregorian calendar. This is the year that Apollo 11 set foot on the moon. That's one claim. The time that the astronauts departed the moon was 1:54 1 seconds p.m. in this, I believe it's an American time zone. And then the moon being split in relation to this, the moon being split in verse 54:1, the first verse of Surah Al-Qamar, it makes a reference to the moon is split, is perhaps predicting Apollo's departure time, this departure time of 54 minutes and 1 second. And taking back the samples is representative of splitting the moon. You're taking one part away from the other. So that's another claim.
Oh, I thought you meant the splitting as in let's split, you meant let's depart, but you didn't mean that. I misunderstood.
Why not? We could even say that. Why not?
Well, yeah.
Right. And the point is to show anything could go if you like tie it this way. And finally, the first verse of Surah Al-Qamar, the surah of the chapter on the moon, has 22 letters. And the Apollo 11 crew happened to take back 21.7 kilograms of moon rock with them, which if you round it up to 22, clearly indicates that the Quran predicts the amount of moon rocks that Apollo 11 would return with.
So, and someone's actually argued this, you say, on a website. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not ridiculing the person. I'm just, because I genuinely think this person was well-intentioned, well-meaning, because the rest of their blog seems quite sober and meaningful. But this is a post that indicates even more so that people like this can fall easily into the trap of trying to draw these connections, and they think, well, what's the harm? But the harm is that it might discredit the entirety of the study of the Quran from mathematical perspectives, because I would say this is overreaching. These two events that we've seen in these claims are connected with a lot of loose cables, I would say. So for instance, the first claim, there are indeed 1,389 verses after this first verse, but choosing that as a reference point was based on the fact that the moon was referenced, for example, in this verse. But the moon is referenced in all sorts of other places too. So choosing this point of reference seems arbitrary. And that's the key concept here. It seems arbitrary. And that's going to come up a lot. Also, why are we converting it to the Gregorian calendar?
Yeah, that's really arbitrary as well.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of human invention related aspects that they're trying to connect it with, which just draws it further and further away to fundamental truth, unchanging truth. The second claim that verse 54:1 is a reference to the departure time of Apollo. Well, the hour is ignored. The timing, so because that number 1 at the beginning is ignored. The timing is based on hardware like clocks that could be calibrated differently. The units of time were invented after the Quranic revelation, like these specific units of time. And the time can be at any arbitrarily precise degrees, such as 1 hour, 54 minutes, and 800 milliseconds in, whereby the link is now lost. It's not 54:1 now. And interestingly, the blog post I took this from, they actually acknowledged that there are these nuances. If you do any arbitrarily precise measures, you kind of lose the link. But they were arguing, well, people round in science, in the scientific community all the time, so rounding up is fine, and so the link holds. But I think they failed to realize that in and of itself was indicative of how arbitrary the connection they were making was. And then finally, this verse about the first verse of Surah Qamar has 22 letters. Apollo 11 brought back 20 kilograms, 22 kilograms of moon rock. Kilograms are also a human invented unit after the Quran. Also, why not in pounds or ounces? Additionally, there's the same issue of rounding. It's 21.7. I mean, yeah, so the point to illustrate here is that if anyone really is interested in this study, and I'm not trying to discourage them from it, is that if you really are, you should try and propose things that you find in the Quran that are not based on shifting sands of arbitrariness. So things like using units that were invented after the Quran, maybe don't rely on that too much, or especially when you're trying to link the Quran to what are called continuous numbers. In other words, numbers that can be arbitrarily precise, like heights, lengths, times. You'll always be sort of fighting an uphill battle because you're trying to link something like, oh, this sum in the Quran, 285, is similar to the atomic number or something, where, well, technically that can be, the average atomic number can be different because of like other factors in the atom and stuff. Basically, like trying to avoid things where the connection seems arbitrary, the connection seems to be based or reliant on things that were invented after the Qur'an's revelation in terms of units, human invented concepts, etc. So with that being said, I am still going to present some things that I would consider, miraculous in the Qur'an. The point of the presentation is to actually propose some. And so I want to reveal discuss some important context that I would like our audience to have in mind to further realize the remarkableness of what I will propose. So first of all, it's well known that the Quran was revealed and transmitted orally. It wasn't written on written material. Written material was not by any means the primary mode of revelation or of transmission of the Quran, especially in the early part of the Prophet's life, peace be upon him, during his revelation. So mainly an oral tradition. It's comprised of 114 chapters. You can say chapters, but usually Muslims stick to the word surahs because chapters have maybe a literary connotation that doesn't exactly apply to surahs. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll call them chapters. And it has a total of 6,236 verses. So a lot of material. It was revealed over 23 years of the prophetic mission, and it was revealed piecemeal. So it was revealed over 2 decades, a long time. And when I say piecemeal, I mean that, well, I should have put this point earlier, but I'll just first say that there's no editorial process either. So when verses were spoken by the Prophet, peace be upon him, they weren't necessarily changed, or there wasn't a mass event where many verses were suddenly just rewritten at the core of the verses. We don't have evidence of the Quran being rewritten 200 years after it's been compiled, or 100 years, or even 50 years, or 30 years, as far as I'm aware. And when I said piecemeal, it kind of goes back to the last point, was that the chapters were not revealed contiguously. And I think this is something that might confuse some Muslims who might not be aware of it. I wasn't for a while. But the Quran wasn't revealed by surah number 1, and first the entire surah number 1 was revealed to the Prophet before surah number 2 was started. That wasn't the case. In fact, the first surah that was revealed to the Prophet was most likely the 96th surah of the Quran, not the first one that we see in the book. And there's a whole study on the ordering of why the chronological revelation is not the canonical revelation. And I think Noman Ali Khan has a really lovely series called Divine Speech and Heavenly Order. I believe it's called Heavenly Order, where he analyzes the ordering of the Quran. At least that's one that I'm familiar with, one study of it, and it's really remarkable in and of itself. But just to give an example, so this is just looking up the order of revelation. But as you can see, so the first column says the order chronologically of when the first verse of that surah, that chapter, was revealed. And the second verse is the chapter's name. The third verse is the canonical number, i.e. what we find in our textbook, the Qur'an's book, today. And the fourth column says whether it was revealed in Mecca or Medina. And what I want to draw your attention to is this last column called Note, where it shows how many exceptions there are. So, for example, in this very first row, it's about Surah Al-Qamar, interestingly, the surah about the moon, which was the 37th chapter or surah initially revealed. But it wasn't the 37th in terms of all of it was just revealed in one shot. Actually, for example, verses 44 to 46 were revealed, years later. And for example, there's another one, Surah Al-An'am, where it's the 55th ordered revealed revelation. It takes the 6th surah in the actual book, but there's a lot of exceptions as to its time of revelation. So the beginning few verses of a chapter or a surah and the end verses could have been revealed over a decade apart or years apart and in different cities. So all of this is to say that an important context to keep in mind is that by all accounts, by all purposes, the Qur'an is an extremely complex, literarily stitched book. It's not contiguous from start to finish. It was revealed over 23 years. It was revealed orally, transmitted orally as well. There's lots of room for hypothetical error if someone was coming from a non-Muslim perspective. And especially, there are no spreadsheets. There are no valid methods of trying to embed mathematical concepts into it, because these are supposedly, if you're an atheist or skeptic about Islam, you're going to be arguing that what I'm going to reveal in this presentation is somehow supposed to have come purely from a mental effort, not a written effort, because remember, like, writing wasn't common at the time. So it's just to add to the gravity of some of these patterns in the Quran. So to move on to that, I'll just be showing 3 types of mathematical patterns in the Quran that I think are of interest. So the first one will be word balance in the Quran. The second one will be interesting patterns with the number 19. And the third one will be this thing called the chapter verse matrix. I haven't called it that. I believe it was a video I watched from Dr. Shabir Ali about this. But
Dr. Shabir Ali has done a lot of work, a great deal of work in this area, which one can see.
Yeah. In fact, pretty much most, if not all, of the things I bring up about the number 19 and the chapter verse matrix, I first saw on his YouTube channel, Let the Quran Speak.
Yeah.
The word balance in the Quran I've heard from different sources.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, it's the one that I was least able to reproduce, and that is partially perhaps due to the fact that Arabic is not my first language. I have some conversational modern standard Arabic skills, but I would not rely on it exclusively when doing this search. So I thought this was perhaps not my specific field. But what I did try and do was use something simple like a Qur'an app on my iPhone, which has...
You can use, I've known people use software to find out this precise issue. Yeah.
I think I was on an app. It's literally called Al-Qur'an, and it lets you find the number of occurrences of words in the Quran. And I used that. So this was probably the most least rigorous part of what I'll show today, but I still think it's interesting. So what we mean by word balances here are there are frequencies of word occurrences in the Quran that appear striking or uncanny based on the meanings of the words considered. So I'll just give 2 examples here. And these were ones that I was able to, do on my own, on my phone, ones that I could confirm, because I didn't want to show anything in this presentation that I couldn't confirm for myself, because as the whole ethos of this is that I want to restore integrity and transparency to this whole field. Yeah. So, for example, the word angels in the Quran, this is what I've heard, and I wanted to see if this is true. The words angels in the Quran, malak, occurs 88 times in the Quran, apparently, either as singular or plural, according to this app that I searched, and it gives the references, so I trust it. So either in singular or plural, it comes as 88 times, the word angels. And what's interesting is that its antonym, devils, shayateen or ash-shayateen, occurs 88 times as well, either as singular or plural. So that's already quite striking, uncanny, especially when you consider that they're not mentioned together all the time. They're often
mentioned like angels, devils in pairs in the text.
Yeah, because that would be someone's first question is, are they just happen to be always mentioned together? Then you'd always get the same, but they're not. They're mentioned in distinct places. They're mentioned in distinct chapters. They're mentioned in distinct verses. Which, remember, the context of Revelation, they're being recited or revealed over decades in different cities, non-contiguously. There's no chance that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was like taking note mentally of like, oh yeah, this is year 16. I wonder how many times I've mentioned the word angels. Maybe I need to sprinkle a couple more devils in there or something. Like, that's just absurd to think. But someone could say maybe it's a coincidence. I think it's unlikely, because, for example, the hereafter, akhirah, is mentioned 115 times, and in different word conjugations. So al-akhirah or lil-akhirah, bil-akhirah, it adds up to 115 times. And the lowest world, al-dunya, so referring to this world, commonly in the Qur'an, is also mentioned 115 times. And I think this is like also, pretty striking. At the very least, you'd have to give it that. It's pretty interesting that these like antonyms appear balanced even in their word count in the Qur'an. Now, I've heard of some more of these word balances, but I've also seen videos from Muslims refuting these word balances as well. So I wanted to show there are these word balances. I can find at least a couple on my own with my limited skills in the Arabic language. And you yourself have told me that you knew some people who are more versed in this study, and they found more even.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't discount that at all. I believe there's something here, and probably this is the one where I would have wished I had the most help on trying to research. So I'd be very interested in.
Essentially, there's a footnote. It's Abdul Halim's translation. He's a professor at SOAS University, same university, actually, published by Oxford University Press. And if you read the introduction, he does actually refer to academic studies in Arabic. Actually, I don't know if they're translated, which analyze these remarkable coincidences, in inverted commas, that you're talking about now. So that this is a very reputable source which does reference this in an academic article.
That's awesome. And yeah, I should check it out. And if it is in Arabic, then it would be, I think, excellent if someone could make that accessible to an English speaking audience. I mean,
yeah. I've never mentioned that before, actually. I was aware of that for a long time, but I've never mentioned it before. But he's impressed with it, and he's obviously a top expert in the field. He's Egyptian himself, he and references these academic studies. So he's convinced, and he's a very respectable top scholar.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could have see more of that. Yeah, and more because again, I've seen some of these word balances being criticized and saying okay, the number of word that day appears doesn't actually correspond to 365. And why would it? Because in Islam, we believe in a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, and some things like that. So this aspect of the study, I think, can for me, it can be it's probably the least ironclad of what I'm going to show. Not to dismiss it, because I believe in it. I think it's awesome, but there's a lot of potential refutations where someone would say, okay, well, you're kind of cherry picking which word conjugation you use, because in Arabic there's a lot of word conjugation, prefixes, and that stuff that can be added. The meaning of a word can change in different contexts. Do you only count words that have the same meaning in their different contexts? Do you discount the ones that mean something else, even though it's the same word in another one? So I'd love to see someone do a better study on this, because I would not say I'm capable at doing this. There's diacritical marks on the words. Do you count the ones that have the exact same diacritical marks, or are you more lenient with that? But yeah, when you're referencing other people who have done this, I just maybe I'd love to see that done and shown. So the thing I want to move on, which will probably be the bulk of my presentation, are these last two mathematical patterns. So the number 19 has been something probably people at least have heard of it being in the Qur'an, and that's because it literally is. I think for good reason people have heard this, because I think it's one of the more unique instances where a number that is that we might have seen maybe interesting patterns about is a number that the Qur'an itself explicitly references. And I think that's a really important aspect to keep in mind. So this is in Surah Muddathir, which is the 74th surah or chapter of the Qur'an, and it mentions that hell is overseen by 19 angels. So it explicitly says alayha tisata ashar, it is overseen by 19, in this context being angels. Now, the verse that follows explains an interesting detail about the significance of this mentioned number. So it's a relatively long verse that explicitly says, and we have made their number, in reference to 19, we have made their number only as a test for the disbelievers. So that's one reason. And the second reason is that so that the people of the book will be certain. So if they were wondering, oh, is Islam the truth? I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew, they would be certain. And thirdly, and the believers will increase in faith. So it'll make people who are already Muslim be more faithful to Islam, have more faith, have more iman. And I mean, I think this is remarkable in terms of how explicitly connected in the Quran this number is to these factors, about faith itself. It's explicitly saying we have made their number. And this number, 19, this prime number is mentioned just like that. So there are a lot of interesting patterns with the number 19. And as I've said, this is a unique case where a number is explicitly mentioned as a means of strengthening the faith of the believers. And at least from a mathematical perspective, I'm not saying this is the entire reason why this number is mentioned. Allahu A'lam, God knows best. But I certainly think a partial reason, at the very least, is its mathematical signature that appears in several instances of the Quran, not least of which is this chapter itself, where it was mentioned first.
Yep.
So the point I'm going to illustrate is that there are uncanny number of multiples of 19 in both this specific chapter and in the Quran more broadly. So just some basic probability. The probability of a random number being divisible by 19 is 1 in 19. So every 19th number in integers is divisible by 19. That's what it means to be a multiple of 19. But roughly it just means that if I told you a random number, the chance of that random number being divisible by 19, if it's a whole number, is roughly 5%. However, probability that two random numbers are both divisible by 19 goes up exponentially, in the sense that it's now 1 over 19. So 1 in 19 multiplied by 1 in 19, because now there are 361 outcomes related to the probability here. So that's around 0.2% chance. 3 in a row would be 1 over 19 times 1 over 19 times 1 over 19, which would be 1 over 6,859. So if I said 3 random numbers, the chance that if I said I have 3 random numbers, the chance that all 3, without you looking at them, are divisible by 19 is very, very, very low. And so the chance of n numbers in a row being divisible by 19 is 1 in 19 to the power of n, which simply means 1 in 19 multiplied by itself n times. So the numbers go down, the probability goes down very quickly. And this is important context to keep in mind because of how many times this pattern comes in the Quran. So for example, the number of words in the verse that discuss the implications of the number 19, that long verse that said their number is to test the disbelievers, to increase the believers in faith, it's got 57 words, which is exactly 19 times 3. So that's already pretty interesting. However, the number of words up until the verse that mentions the number 19, so right before it, is 95, which is 19 times 5. So this is, getting quite very unlikely. And then this was very interesting when I found this out. The number of letters up until the word 19 itself, so not including, but right up to when the word 19 is mentioned, the Arabic word tis'ata ashar, is 361, which is 19 squared. It's 19 times 19. Now we're really getting into this would make someone at least raise an eyebrow, I would imagine. And then the number of words up to the 19th verse is 57, 19 times 3 again. So, maybe someone can argue, okay, maybe you're cherry picking the number of which parts that you're looking at, but I would say even then, the probability that these would occur at this frequency is astronomically low. Is very, very, very uncanny at the very least, especially in a document that is explicitly mentioning this number as a phenomenon of interest that would raise the faith of believers. I mean, these mathematical aspects of the Quran could not have been looked at sufficiently without a computer until in the past 100 years or so, for instance, right? It's very interesting. I think even more interesting is I just wanted to again bring up that this is just some literal programming code that I ran to recapitulate everything I said. So everything I've said actually exists there. If for any programmers interested, they can like just take a screenshot of this and do it themselves. All you need is this library, this module called PyQuran, this software, and then you can just copy and paste this code. You can scrutinize it if you want, and everything I've said is there. So this is just amazing. So now moving on, still about the number 19. Wow. I mentioned very early on the first revelation revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, is traditionally agreed upon to be the first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq. Yep. Famously beginning with, read in the name of your Lord who created. It's a very famous, every Muslim will at least know the story of the Prophet's first revelation, peace be upon him. So the number of letters in these first 5 verses, the first 5 verses, the first revelation ever, the first 5 verses that were ever revealed to the Prophet, the number of letters is 76, which is 19 times 4. The number of letters in the remaining verses, so from that point onwards, is 209, which is 19 times 11. So that also means that the number of letters in all the verses in total is 285, which is 19 times 15. The number of verses in the surah itself is also undeniable, is 19. Surah Al-Alaq has 19 verses. And additionally, it's the 96th surah, meaning that there are 95 preceding chapters in the canonical book of the Qur'an, 95 preceding chapters, meaning 19 times 5 preceding chapters, and 19 chapters following it, if you include the chapter itself. And this also brings me to another point, which is that the Qur'an itself is 114 chapters, which is 19 times 6. I think this is just, to me at least, I think like rationally, I think it's beyond coincidence that this many multiples of 19 should emerge in a text by random. Mm-hmm. Especially when you consider the number itself is assigned significance in the text that says it's significant. That's an important point. It's not just some random number.
The number 19 is really significant. It's not just a random stat, as if the Quran would just quote random statistics. That's not how it works. Everything in the Quran is extremely significant, morally, spiritually, and so on. So we are alerted to something when it's mentioned like that.
Exactly. So yeah, like it's just even more reason to believe that the author of the Quran was well aware of the link between this pattern and the Quran itself. And we believe the author of the Quran is God himself. Mm-hmm. So I think this kind of, at the very least to me, it partially makes a lot of sense that this is the partial reason at the very least that the Quran mentions the number of 19 as being a means of strengthening the conviction of believers in this book. I mean, someone who, like myself, appreciates maths, because maths is, it's irrefutable. Maths itself is irrefutable. Now, if we've looked at examples with the moon and stuff, but the fundamental aspects of maths, multiples, summations, arithmetic operations, they're undeniable. And I think that's one of the strengths of this aspect of the Quran in illustrating its inhuman origin. So I thought this was really, really remarkable. I thought this was not something that could be discounted. And and when I found this out myself and like recomputed the result just to make sure.
You checked all this yourself then?
Yes, I checked this. I wrote the code for this as well. It's very similar to the previous one. But anyone who wants to redo it themselves, you can just have a look at this screenshot. And if you know some even very basic Python programming language, you should be able to, again, reproduce these results. So yeah, I think this is really remarkable to me, and makes me very appreciative of this aspect of the Quran, which makes me even more saddened to see people dismiss it entirely, or even say that this pattern doesn't exist. I've heard some people say, well, this number, there's nothing to it in the Quran. And these are Muslims, and I know they're well-intentioned, but even they have been led to believe that it's all just hocus pocus and like there's nothing there. No, there's something there, and it's amazing to take a look at. Now the final.
Sorry, I mean, sorry to interrupt.
Please.
Pause a second. I want to go back to this book because whilst you were talking, I was sneakily trying to find the reference that I mentioned earlier on. podcast. So to just explain what this book is, this is an English translation of the meanings of the Quran. The Quran, a translation by Abdul Halim. He's an Egyptian, so he's a native Arabic speaker. He was educated at Cambridge and many other places, and he's professor of Islamic Studies at the School of Oriental African Studies at the University of London, the same university where you are based. He's one of the world's most distinguished academics in the Quran. He speaks English perfectly. He lives here in London. And this book, this translation is published by Oxford University Press. I was going to read to you briefly in the introduction to this translation in a section called Stylistic Features. Now, this is in page 19 of his introduction. He says the following: a central feature of Quranic style is contrast between this world and the next, each occurring exactly 115 times, between believers and disbelievers, between paradise and hell. This has been studied in great detail, and scholars have found truly remarkable patterns of contrasts: angels and devils, life and death, secrecy and openness, and so on, occurring exactly the same number of times. And there's a footnote at the bottom. This is the reference I wanted to mention to an academic work. It is in Arabic, published in Cairo. A is initial, Nawfal, Nawfal, and then there's an Arabic title, and my Arabic's not good enough. I'm embarrassed myself. But anyway, you can find it for yourself easily online. And then he continues, this sense of balance in the text has continued in passages where the prophet is instructed to say, and so it goes on. But I just wanted to mention that these, he mentions the very same doublets or extraordinary contrasts occurring the same numbers of time that you do, and others as well, between believers and disbelievers, secrecy and openness, and so on. So the implication being there are many others which have been noted actually for a long, long time. This is not a new study, but there's a respected academic reference if people want to follow it up for themselves. So thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. SubhanAllah. Yeah, thank you for filling in basically on the shortcomings of my first part of it.
Well, on the contrary, you verified all this yourself, and so this is
thank you. No, but that genuinely makes me very happy, because that I felt that was the part where I felt least qualified to continue.
No, and far from it. You're on very solid ground, it seems.
No, thank you. No, that's actually perfect. So I feel like you've actually helped complete this presentation. So thank you. That's very, very, very kind and very helpful. And awesome. So the very last thing I want to bring up is this thing that has been called the chapter verse matrix. So again, I haven't come up with this cool name. This was dubbed, at least I found it on Dr. Shabir Ali's YouTube channel, or his team's YouTube channel, Let the Quran Speak. And he's called it the chapter verse matrix. I don't know if he's coined the term, but it's not important. The point is to just have a look at this. So I'll basically introduce this the way he did. I think it was best. So in the Quran, in Surah Al-Fajr's third verse, God swears an oath by the even and the odd. And in the Quran, Allah swears oaths by many different concepts, and it was known at the time that when you want to get people's attention, you would swear by an oath, and often a lot of surahs start with that. So it's to get the attention of the people, and it's also not uncommon that the content of the oath, of what is being sworn by, is related or indicative of the concept, or the topic that is going to be talked about. So this is God swears by the even and the odd, which the reason I bring it up is because it is another reference that these fundamental mathematical concepts are being mentioned in the Quran. So this is known as parity in maths. It's a fancy word for saying what means even and odd, but this is called parity, and it turns out that this concept of parity might have something to do with the structure of the Quran itself. So this is probably one of the more I would say complex things that I want to show. It's not very complex in terms of the final results, but in terms of getting there visually, it might be challenging. So I pray that I can do justice to it. And please interrupt me if anything is unclear. So, because if anything's unclear to you, then it's most likely unclear to everyone else. So in the Quran, we have surah numbers. In the book we have today, Surah Al-Fatiha is number 1, and Surah Al-Baqarah is number 2, etc., etc. And the last surah is Surah Al-Nas, 114. And each of these surahs, each of these chapters has a number of verses. Surah Al-Fatiha has 7 verses, Surah Al-Baqarah has 286 verses, and so on. And the 114th chapter has 6 verses. If we add the surah number and the number of verses of that surah, we can come up with this chapter verse sum result. So for Surah Al-Fatiha, it would be surah number 1 plus the number of verses it has, which is 7, we get 8. For Surah Al-Baqarah, it's surah number 2, it has 286 verses, we get 288, etc., etc. Do it for all the 115 chapters of the Qur'an, you'll get 115 results, right? So that's pretty much all we need to do. So in terms of the simplicity of arriving there, that's it. So everything else emerges from just seeing whether that chapter verse sum result is even or odd. So for example, the chapter verse sum for the first surah is even. The parity of the first chapter verse sum result is even, because the chapter verse sum is 8. 8's an even number. For the second result, 288, that's also even. For the third result, is 203, which is odd, and so on. Wow. So we've just have one column where we add the surah number and the number of verses of that surah. And then we just see which of them are even and which of them are odd. Yeah, that's it. So if we add up the number of the surah numbers in the Quran, so if you add up 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 all the way to plus 114, what's known as the arithmetic sum of the Quran's chapter numbers, you get the number 6,555. Okay, there's nothing special yet. If you do the same for the number of verses in the Quran, so each surah's verse number, just adding 7 for Surah Al-Fatiha plus 286 plus Surah Al-Baqarah, etc., etc., you get 6,236. I mentioned this at the very beginning. The Quran has 6,236 verses. So all we've done so far is just add the surah numbers of the Quran and add the verse numbers of the Quran. Then we go back to this chapter verse sum that we computed earlier, which is, again, simply derived from adding the surah number and verse number of each chapter. If you add the chapter verse sums of the odd results of this, so if you add up the odd results, which I've tried to demarcate in blue, it's a little bit difficult to see, but if you add every odd result from this chapter verse sum, so 203, 125, 171, 213, etc., etc., 115, 113 of this chapter verse sum result, if you add all the odd numbers, first of all, you find out that there's 57 odd numbers and 57 even numbers. It's perfectly balanced, which is already interesting in itself. For it to be exactly 57, even though you would say it's 50-50, but to get the exact numbers is still unlikely. If you add the odd results, you get the number 6,555, which happens to also be the sum of surah numbers in the Quran. So the odd result of these 57 odd results, the sum of the odd results is 6,555, which is exactly the sum of the surah numbers. And these two results can absolutely be different. There's no need for them to be the same. It is not an inherent property of books like this. And I'm going to illustrate that as well.
Can I just, sorry, you
yes,
said I could interrupt. You mentioned that there were 57. What was it, 57 again? Was the total number of?
It's 57 odd results from the chapter verse sum and 57 even results from the chapter verse sum.
And if you divide 57 by 3, you get
19. Yeah, as well. Yeah. So yeah, that's also and I didn't even think about that, but yeah, you get multiple 19.
19 well, why not keep the 19 story? Keep
yeah. In fact, I thought it was funny because when you brought up the Abdul Halim introduction, you mentioned it was on page 19, and that made me laugh a bit. Because
this is not an actual proof. This is just random Oxford University Press publication. That's true.
Yeah. But just made me laugh.
It's scary. No, this 19 that is 57 is multiples of 19. That was the point, right?
Yes. So the sum of the odd results. So remember, chapter verse sum, there's 114 results, 57 of them are odd, 57 of them happen to be even.
Yeah.
If you add up the 57 odd results, you get 6,555. That's exactly the sum of surah numbers, which is pretty remarkable because, first of all, these numbers do not have to be the same at all. Second of all, consider the fact that this sum of surah numbers was gained by adding 114 numbers, but this sum of odd results that reaches the same total sum was only gained from 57 numbers. Half the number of numbers gave the same result, which means whatever numbers it was missing was perfectly counterbalanced with whatever numbers it was gained when you're counting like the number of verses in this chapter verse sum.
Yeah.
So that's already remarkable. But if there's this like, double coincidence where if you add the remaining 57 even results, so the remaining 57 results, which are the even numbers in this chapter verse sum, you get 6,236, which is the sum of the verses number in the Qur'an. And I think, people should like seriously think about this in terms of like the gravity of like what this is. This is an insane double coincidence of balance. It is absolutely not inherent to the property of just adding the surah number and the verse number. And I want to show that. So yeah, so this is just putting it in words. The 57 odd chapter verse sum results add up to exactly the sum of surahs in the Quran. And the 57 even chapter verse sum results add up to exactly the sum of verses in the Quran. And this remarkable balance, there's absolutely does not need to be this way. And to me, this is also reminiscent of this concept of a checksum in computer science. So in computer science, a checksum is it's a value, just a numeric value calculated from data to detect whether there were errors during the transmission of that data. So over the internet, for example, right now, Paul, like both of our internet Wi-Fi routers are sending and receiving packets of data, packets of the pixels on my screen and on your screen, uploading and downloading, right? And our computers are inherently running an algorithm just to check that data that it's receiving has not been corrupted in transit, has not been like interfered with, or maybe some like cable was like going wrong, or maybe there was like the packet was sent wrong or something like that. And the way it can check for whether it was faulty is by applying a mathematical algorithm to the data to compute a signature known as a checksum. So when the data is received, the checksum is recalculated on the receiver's end, and it's compared to what the sender said the checksum was. And if they match, the data is likely intact. If not, errors have occurred. In other words, a checksum is indicative of, it's a tool for verifying the preservation of information. And I want to give a simple example because this is maybe a lot. So imagine you want to send a message, hello, over the internet. And let's adopt a simple numeric scheme where the values of letters are their position in the alphabet. A is 1, B is 2, Z is 26. The numerical value of hello will then be 8, because H is the 8th letter, plus 5, because E is the 5th letter, and so on, plus 12, plus 12, plus 15. So the checksum, someone might say, how about we make a checksum, which is the sum of the letters, right? So you send the message and the checksum to me, okay? And you send the word hello and the checksum that should be for the word hello, which is 52. Then I receive this data, on my own time, and I receive both your message and what the checksum was. And if my result is 52, then I know it's correct. If not, then I know it indicates lost information. So for example, if I receive the word hell, which shows the O is missing, and also this checksum of 52, then what I would do is recompute, did Paul really mean to send me the word hell? I would just recompute the value that hell would have. So 8 plus 5 plus 12 plus 12, it adds up to 37, not 52. It doesn't add up to the checksum you said. So that indicates something went wrong, and it would be to my relief. So that's the idea of a checksum. It's a means of indicating information preservation. Now, the reason I think it's indicative and relevant to this example is because, hope this will play, if you change any number of verses in the Quran, so if you add or remove a single verse in the Quran, right now you see the number, sum of surah number equals the sum of odd results. The sum of verse number equals the sum of even results. But if I, for example, change the number of surahs, number of verses in the first chapter of the Quran to 8, from 7 to 8, this balance collapses. So the sum of odd results is no longer equal to the sum of surah number. Sum of even results is no longer equal to the verse number. And you can, like, even if I put this back and then I do it for like a different, if I remove a verse somewhere, I think that's what I do next. I think I changed it to 74 or something. Like the same balance, it just collapses. So this absolutely does not have to be the case. So just adding or removing a single verse, and certainly adding or removing a chapter, would remove this balance completely. And that, to me, makes me think of it as a checksum, because it is another of the many means of verifying that what we have today at least has this remarkable mathematical signature of balance that indicates it has been preserved from the original transmission.
Okay, can I just commend you on your graphics? They're absolutely extraordinary. I love the fact that in real time now we can actually manipulate the number of verses and so on, and see the effect in live time. That's remarkable. Well done.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thank you. It's a pre-recorded video, but I do have the live effect on an Excel sheet, but I didn't want to switch to Excel, so I had pre-recorded this. So yeah, it is live, well, originally. But thank you very much. And I wanted to further show that this is not a common feature, because I can imagine someone saying I think the favorite tool of skeptics in this area would probably be to say it's all a coincidence. And, I can't blame them. But I want to show that you can show that this is very unlikely to be a coincidence in many different ways. But a very simple way would be to show that this doesn't occur often. And so I wanted to do just a case study of whether this result, this balance, this chapter verse matrix appears in the Bible. So both the Old Testament and New Testament. And the reason I chose this as a case study was because I thought it was a good analogy, a good analogous sample for a book that has chapters and it has verses, clear verses, number of verses for each of the chapters. Typical books don't include how many sentences are in their chapters, whereas these ancient holy books do. And it also happens to be a holy book, which is even more like in the same analogous field. So I thought that was also appropriate. But so compared with another chapter verse text, such as the books of the Bible, this balanced result does not appear. For example, this is the book of Genesis, and these are the actual chapter number of verses in Genesis. And the red indicates that these values do not equal the values of the chapter sums and the verses sums. So in fact, I actually did this using programming for every single book in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and everything you see in red indicates that this balance did not occur. And this isn't to deride the Bible. It's simply an exercise in showing that even with a substantial population size of examples that are analogous in terms of structure, literary structure to the Quran, you won't find this pattern of balance, of this exquisite, precise, double coincidental, incredible balance. I even made it easier to find it because I would count even one of the coincidences occurring. If the sum of the odd results equated to the chapter numbers and call it a day, that would count as a pass. You don't even have to get the double coincidence of the even result having to mean the sum of the verses. Even that didn't occur. So it didn't occur in any of the 74 books that I examined. And again, it's not to disparage the Bible. I mean, it's not what I'm doing it for. It's just simply to use it as a case study. And it just shows that this result does not occur often, randomly, at all. And with this sample size, I can confidently say, at least empirically, it has a less than 1.4% chance of occurring. It occurs 1 in 75 books, that one being the Quran and the 74 other books being like a population study with the Bible books. So that's just simply to refute the idea that it's simply a coincidence, because I think it's a real reach to say it's a coincidence. I think someone would have a much better rational argument saying that it was deliberately put there, but we'll get to refuting that in a minute as well. Literally now. So some refutations, just because I'm kind of wrapping up now, is you're overreaching or cherry picking to me. So I would say that I try to stick to analyzing examples where there were simple and few numbers of arithmetic operations, not too many chained together and without good reason. I think I always tried to link, I hope it was clear, but I always tried to link the mathematical pattern I was trying to look at with something from the Qur'an itself, with an explicit key text referencing either the number itself with the 19 or the fundamental mathematical concept like parity, even and odd, in the Qur'an as well. So I tried to keep it as close to the source material as possible and with as few operations and very simple arithmetic operations. I mean, we just did multiples, which are just trying to do summations and picking which of them are even and odd, for example. I didn't do, taking the logarithm of something or taking the exponent of something or converting something to a complex number and then converting it back into a different feature space. I didn't do any of that. And I don't think you need to do any of that. I didn't pick out which numbers exhibit some very niche or esoteric mathematical, type of number. I didn't do, because simply I don't know that. I don't have the knowledge to do that. But I just didn't. I stuck to simple concepts. So that would be my refutation to that refutation. Then, this favorite line is that it's all a coincidence. And I would say if you believe all of this is a coincidence, considering like the types of numbers and probabilities involved, I would say you probably need to check your standards of what you consider probable and not. Because if you call that a coincidence, and I say this like, politely, if you call that a coincidence, then are you applying the same standard, the same rigor in your day-to-day life? I think in Hamza Tzortzis's book, The Divine Reality, I think he's called like this an epistemological double standard, which I think is a nice phrase. It just simply means like you have a different standard of how you view knowledge, of how you view reality based on its context, the context suiting you. I mean, I think most people, if you told them even there's a 20% chance that they'll be struck by lightning if they step outside today, they won't walk outside. But if they say, oh yeah, this is it's a 0.01% chance of occurring, well, that's a chance. It must have been the coincidence there. I think that's a bit unfair. And they're free to believe that, but I think they'd probably have to like have some introspection on why are you insisting on this like extreme perfection of an error bar for anything that doesn't agree with your worldview. Well, it's probably like a mechanism of trying to reject it. And then you have to like think about your intellectual honesty and confirmation bias. And, and the third thing they might say is that it's done deliberately, which I obviously say, yes, it was. I think it was done deliberately, but not by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but by the author of the Qur'an, God. That's what we believe. And I think the easiest, I can say all sorts of refutations for this, but I think probably the simplest and most elegant is this argument from silence. Imagine what you'd have to argue to say that this was done deliberately. You're saying that in that, remember the context of a revelation, no written material, everything's in people's heads basically, because it's an oral transmission revealed contiguously over 23 years by one human. And the revelation was not contiguous, sorry. So it's in different parts, are revealed different times, et cetera, that with all that that protocol for compiling the Quran, that someone is there, like, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is supposedly trying to inject this, mathematical pattern into the Quran. And, oh, wait, hang on, I have to add a new verse. Let me just make sure this chapter verse matrix adds up still. And, oh, wait, maybe I should change the number of words here to add up to 19. Yeah, that'll be a good one. All this immense effort that would have been just impossible to do. I mean, trying to recreate the chapter verse matrix as a principle in a text from scratch is challenging, let alone, like, that's with a computer, let alone from someone in their mind in the 7th century in the desert of Arabia. But even if you say someone did all of that, why on earth would they not advertise it by screaming about it? If you're saying that this is a man who claims to be a prophet of God, then you would think that he would do anything in his interest in order to try and verify that claim to other people. And if he's done it deliberately, putting all these numbers, then surely he would want to reap the fruits of his labor.
Attention to it. Oh, look at this remarkable property.
Yeah, exactly. Bring attention to it and say, look at this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was never done. I mean, there was no trace of people knowing about this at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and until way later, like literally millennia later, until we're finding some of these patterns. So I think it's silly. So if you say it's not a coincidence, and it's not cherry picking, and it's not done by a human, well, then maybe your last refuge is to say it's done by a non-human super intelligence. Like, oh, maybe it's the devil, you know, maybe they'll consider him very intelligent or whatever, very crafty. But I think this is almost laughable as a contention, because the content of the Quran is enough to serve as a refutation to this. I mean, the Quran has no shortage of examples of warning Muslims against the devil. I mean, this is a verse I bring up. I think it's pretty clear cut. In the 35th chapter of the Quran, it says in verse 6, says, Satan is your enemy, so treat him as an enemy, and invites his follower only to enter the blazing fire. Yeah. So that doesn't sound like the type of book the devil would write. He writes a book that is making people very vigilant about him, to seek refuge from him with God, to be good to your parents, to give like charity, you know, to guard your eyes and stuff. Yeah, that's a very satanic book. I mean, obviously being sarcastic, like, it makes no sense. So that's just the brief summary of the refutations that someone I thought could make, some rebuttals they could make. I think at the end of the day, they are, no matter how many hoops you try and mental gymnastics you try and jump through, I think at some point you will have to cover your own logic to accept that this is just a coincidence or from deliberate human effort or whatever. And there would be some gap in that chain of reasoning. And that's for that own person to disclose. It's not my job to, like, you know, convince them. I just present what I find. And to move on, I don't know if this is overkill, but it's not just the mathematical patterns in the Quran. And I'm just going to go over this very briefly because I know I'm going quite over time. But the Quran has no shortage of these like remarkable phenomena in all sorts of domains, not just maths. For example, I've listed just a few examples of some that I really like personally. And even listed videos where I could that people can search for, and I encourage them to do that. You'll be blown away. So like from this channel, Arabic 101, the Quran is known to make Hebrew word plays. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not speak Hebrew, you know? So like mentioning the Prophet Zechariah in a verse that's about the remembrance of God in Arabic. Well, the name Zechariah in Hebrew means the remembrance of God or mention of the Lord. So there's a double entendre going there, but they only exist if you know Hebrew. And I know Dr. Ali Ataie, who's one of my favorites on your show. He's also done a video on this that's really great. I think it's called Marvels of the Quran. Yes. Actually, I think I've referenced it here as well. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the Quran includes remarkably accurate facts about ancient Egypt, which was a civilization that was lost to the Arabs and certainly to ourselves until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. People underestimate.
The British Museum, by the way, here in London. It really belongs back where it was found in Egypt. This is a nice plug here for, can we please return these artifacts to their country of origin, where we usually nicked them during the colonial period. So, sorry, that's my little rant there.
That's I think a very empathetic sentiment, especially in the Middle East and Arab world. A lot of our stuff happens to be in the British Museum.
Especially the Rosetta Stone, which is an absolute incredible civilizational monument, where we were first time in thousands of years we're actually able to decipher hieroglyphics, the Egyptian language at that time, thousands of years ago. But it belongs in Egypt, where it was dug up and nicked by the British, unfortunately.
I think if the British Museum sent back, everything that they've taken from places that aren't Britain, it'll be a pretty vacant slot.
Well, they could turn it into a very nice hotel, I think. There's been lots of very nice rooms, fantastic architecture, nice central London real estate, turn it into a nice hotel. That's my suggestion.
Yeah. And that hotel will have a rich history, and that will be the museum's theme.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Sorry,
like
you from your serious purpose.
No. Absolutely, you can always interject. But this video, I recommend everyone watch it. I know it's 30 minutes, but every Muslim I think should watch it, and non-Muslim as well, because I think this channel did an excellent job for this video, especially in showing examples in the Quran that are just incredible in terms of the accuracy of how it's describing different ancient Egyptian civilizations, because there wasn't just one. They had like Egyptologists like segment it into different kingdoms, like Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. And this video covers it all. To give an example that's like relatively simple, like in the Quran, the king at the time of Joseph, at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, is always referred to as king, Malik in the Quran. But the king of the time of Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, is referred to as Pharaoh. And it's exclusively like that. So Moses is the king in the story of Moses is always called Pharaoh. The king in the story of Joseph is always called king, peace be upon the prophets, which is very interesting because those are the correct descriptions of the kings at those times.
Which the Bible gets wrong, by the way.
Yes,
you were going to mention that. The Bible, unfortunately, gets it wrong. The Quran gets it right. In areas which is impossible for a 7th century Arab or anyone else on the planet, to be honest, could possibly have got precisely correct.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people underestimate how old and how lost the civilization of Egypt was to like progeny. I mean, they just might think, oh yeah, maybe the Arabs lived in a desert, it's nearby, surely they must have, like, no, it's not like that. Like, it was super old. Like, it's really, really like millennia apart. They had no knowledge of this civilization to that extent. And yeah, like you said, the Bible gets it wrong. So refutation that it somehow copied from the Bible means that, yes, it was copied, and then somehow the person copying it knew what was correct. And was
but often the case, the Quran sees its role, as a subject, but its role vis-a-vis the previous scriptures, the extant scriptures, as correcting them, as an arbitrator. But muhaymin, this Arabic word, has that kind of significance in the Quran's relationship with the existing Bible, correcting it and making sure we have the true understanding of history, for example.
Absolutely, exactly. That's the word muhayyim. That the Quran serves to verify the truth in these scriptures, which still have some truth in them, but shows what is true in them and what we as Muslims believe has been altered over time. So I recommend, I can't do justice to this entire video. Like I really recommend people watch it, including yourself, Paul, if you haven't already.
I also, just a small advert for Dr. Louis Fatoui's videos on blogging theology, where he also addresses these very, very questions about ancient Egypt and the Bible. The contrast between the Bible and the Quran when it comes to Egyptian history is discussed at length by Dr. Louis Fatoui, as well as this video you're mentioning, of course.
Okay. I'll give that a watch as well. Thank you for that. And then moving on, like, just again, I'm just kind of going rapid fire through these ones, but the Quran includes like very incredibly complex ring-like literary structures that read coherently in a linear style, which people are familiar with, but also have a meaning in from a palindromic perspective. And just simply put, humans don't talk like this. And remember the context. It's not written at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Supposedly, this thematic ring-like structure is being said from the get-go. Some verses that are surahs that are 286 verses long and aren't revealed contiguously, yet they have this, like, there's a tiny screenshot here. It doesn't do it justice. I recommend people watching it. But like, for example, this exists in many surahs in the Quran, many chapters, but even in Surah Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, the first so many verses are a mirror to the theme of the last verses or the last verses. And if you divide the chapter into chunks, you'll notice that the chunks mirror each other across the central axis. And in Surah Baqarah, it's even more interesting because each of those chunks is a ring-like structure in and of itself. I mean, again, I think I think Nouman Ali Khan has talked about this in Heavenly Order, which I recommend people look up. But yeah, I mean, that is just, to me, from a literary perspective, impossible. It's just ridiculous to think that a person is going to plan that. And again, it wasn't advertised. So there's that argument from silence again. And just to finish off, like just a few more, I'm sorry, because I'm really like, yeah, I think these are like amazing. The Quran, it might be like known that people know that the Quran accurately describes embryonic development, even at a microscopic level, obviously unknown to 7th century Arabs and much thereafter. I've heard some people think that this is because the Muslims were advanced in science, but they forget that the Muslims became advanced in science after the Islam came, not before. And this is just a video about this professor, Keith Moore, a Canadian professor. He was professor of anatomy at the University of Toronto, I believe, and he's written textbooks on embryology. So he was like a pretty authoritative figure on the subject. And by a series of events, he encountered religious Muslim figures who wanted him to look at the Qur'an's description of embryology, and he was stunned by the accuracy at which the Quran uses its language to describe embryological development. So much so, I mean, you can watch this video, and he's just talking about it, and so saying the parallels between how he would describe it using his scientific language versus to how the Quran describes it. And again, the Quran isn't a book about science, but it just so happens that the facts that it talks about can be scientifically verified. And if they can't be scientifically examined because we don't have the tools for it, then it's still open for discussion. So whatever can be tested empirically with the tools we have access to has been true. Whatever we can't test, we don't have an answer for, but it doesn't mean it's not true. It means we are not able to test it yet. And then this kind of more generically, the Quran gets all manner of scientific facts correct about our universe and biology that could not have been known to 7th century Arabs. And I know this is also a surprisingly contentious area, and I've seen on your channel like the different perspectives of scientists have had about talking about scientific miracles in the Quran. And I think it's a good nuanced discussion to have because it basically suffers from the same problems as the mathematical miracles, right?
Like very much so,
yeah, like people overreaching and stuff. And again, I think it's out of good intention, but maybe they go too far to show something, and it makes people dismissive of the entire subject as a whole, which I think is a shame, because I think there are really remarkable facts in the Quran, like the fact that the universe emerged from a single point, what we would call the Big Bang Theory, and that the
expanding as well. That's the
expanding. That, for example, I think I put a picture of bees because I believe the Quran references like the worker honeybees as female in the feminine adjective, which is they're actually female, and people didn't know this. The fact that the moon reflects the sun's light, the moon is described as munira in the Quran, which means something that is reflective of light, whereas the sun is described as a lamp, siraj, which indicates that it is the source of heat and light. People didn't know this. They couldn't confirm, necessarily that the moon wasn't creating its own light. And so, I mean, I will say the same caveat that these scientists have said, that these Quranic verses might not exactly be referencing the Big Bang or the expansion of the universe. From my perspective, I think it's likely, but the reason that they say, well, it doesn't necessarily tie it to that is because we don't want to tie the Quran's verses on matters that could potentially change in the future, because that's the nature of science. It can change, much to contrary, popular belief. And so we don't, but I still think there's a tremendous number of scientific verifiable facts in the Quran that are just verifiable. And the gender of honeybees is probably not going to change anytime soon. Or the moon isn't going to not be reflective of us.
As we go into the whole area of trans bees, of course, which
yeah. I mean, I don't know.
In science, where this male bee identifies as a female bee, and they have a trans bee.
Until that point reaches, but yeah, the point is that I still think it's a valid field of study. But again, it has to be approached with the same level of rigor and caution. Exactly. And there's some other facts that I think people might not really internalize. One is that the Quran's Arabic genuinely superseded the best poets of Arabia. despite the Prophet, peace be upon him, not being a poet. And here I just have a quote from one of the enemies of the Prophet at the time, Walid ibn Mughira, who he essentially is praising the Qur'an's language, even though he was an enemy of the Prophet. But he was just saying, I have, heard such speech from him. And he says, by Allah, but they would, refer to God as Allah, even when they didn't believe in Islam. It's like saying by God, So it doesn't mean he was necessarily Muslim, but he says, I have heard such speech from him as can neither be the speech of a mortal nor of jinn, like of these in Islam, there's this concept of like demons and jinn. I think demons is not the right word. I think jinn is its own word, to be honest. Yeah. Its beauty, no doubt, surpasses the beauty of all speeches, cannot be superseded. It is not the speech of any human being. And he was a prominent poet in Mecca and a leader of the pre-Islamic Mecca. So he was an authority on the subject. And I believe, again, in Hamzat Sortis's book, which I recommend, The Divine Reality, he illustrates this topic well. He says, if there was any time in history where a poet had the best possible shot of creating a copy of the Quran that would supersede it, it would have been the time that the Quran was revealed, because the Quran was revealed at the height of pristine Arabic language. And poetry was just like an industry where, you could think of it as like the artists of the time, and they were heavily praised in that society. So they had the best poets. And the proof that it wasn't superseded is that the Quran existed. The first 13 years of the Prophet's mission was a primarily non-combative, non-violent, non-defensive mission. He was just basically taking all sorts of abuse without retaliating, because he wasn't allowed to do so. All he had was the words of the Quran. So that was his only asset. So why are people converting to Islam if there was an alternative poet who says, oh, that Quran, that's nothing, listen to this? And then people would be like, oh yeah, you're right, it really is nothing. But not only was the Quran not nothing, but it was so immensely powerful in its language, to the point that the people in the tribe of the Prophet, his enemies, were plotting to kill him. I mean, it was taboo to try and kill your own tribe member. And instead of trying to come up with better words, they would resort to that last resort of trying to kill him. I mean, is it easier to come up with better words, or is it easier to plot and kill someone that's taboo in your society? The fact they had to resort to that measure indicates that they failed to produce something that was linguistically better. This is the last part, I promise. But the Prophet ﷺ is more like well-known, also is known to have made extremely precise, in other words, risky predictions of the future that have come to pass, that have been verified to come to pass. And I give an example of this. This is in the Hadith book, the collections of the sayings of the Prophet, Sunan Ibn Majah. And it's when the Prophet ﷺ says, when you see the barefoot, naked, destitute shepherds competing in constructing tall buildings, which scholars say these are referring to the Arab nomads of Arabia, for example. And there's no realm where you would make a prediction like this. If you had to make a prediction about people building tall buildings at that time, you could opt for the Persians or the Romans. You would not opt for making that prediction for people living as nomads in the desert. And yet that's exactly what we see today in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, for example. Just like the competition they're doing, trying to build these extremely tall buildings like the Burj Khalifa. I mean, I think that's a pretty strong evidence in and of itself, if nothing else was here. And then also the fact that the Quran has been demonstrably preserved for 1,400 plus years, as God said it would be. Another example where the claim is being made in the text itself, which makes it doubly important, right? God said that he would preserve the Quran, and it's been preserved. It's an only known book to have gone through this preservation throughout that period of time, with no changes in the words or even letters of the Quran, between hundreds of thousands of communities across the world who had memorized it since that time. If it wasn't preserved, you'd expect at least one community to have some double standard version of it, but we don't find that. Yeah. And this is just a manuscript of the Birmingham Qur'an, which was dated to within years of the Prophet's lifetime with radiocarbon dating, and it's consistent with today's Qur'an. So the parts of this that we have today are consistent with the Qur'an. And finally, I'll just want to end by saying, like, people also don't realize that in the Prophet, peace be upon him's life, the Prophet was offered great wealth and political authority at one episode of his life by his opponents in Mecca. They wanted to shut him down without having to resort to like killing him yet at that time. And they're like, okay, listen, you're getting a lot of followers, but this monotheism business doesn't really work with us. So how about we do a little bit of a compromise? It's like essentially saying, how about we practice your religion on Sundays, but we get Mondays and you can go back on Tuesdays, and we'll give you, will make you the richest man in Mecca. We'll give you all the women that you want. We'll make you the chief of Mecca, essentially. Put you in a very high position of authority. All you have to do is slightly compromise on your monotheistic values. And the Prophet obviously refused. If there was any time that someone who claims the Prophet, ma'adallah, was a charlatan, this is like a, irreconcilable fact with that proposition. That would have been a perfect time for someone like that allegedly to take over, but he didn't. And this verse was revealed that, say, Prophet, I am only a mortal like you, but it has been revealed to me that your God is one. Take the straight path to him and seek his forgiveness. Woe to the idolaters. So I think that really is the end. It's just some sources, just some links, some of the places I found these like Bible statistics, and a couple of videos from the Quran speak on the mathematical patterns that I largely use. And yeah, that's essentially it. So if you have any questions, Paul, like you can run them by me. I hope everything was like relatively clear. I hope I didn't lose any of your viewers along the way.
No. I think the strength of your presentation was that it was very clear, well research grounded in sober analysis rather than extravagant eisegesis, as academics call it, reading things into text rather than exegesis, reading, trying to get the meaning from the text as it is. So this is a very helpful, sober, measured, as you call it, methodology that you've adopted. And we can independently fact check what you're saying. I like the fact that you've given us codes we can copy and paste. I, for one, will not be doing that. That's not something that I will do. But there are people out there who will want to fact check it, which is great. So I really appreciate your openness and your willingness to be held to account in what you're saying. And it's good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just hope that this sort of reignites this conversation about looking at the Quran from this perspective, although I don't want people to go overboard, obviously. That was the point at the very beginning. But yeah, the Quran has all sorts of miraculous aspects, and each one will touch someone differently. And I think it would be a shame to close the door on this subject when I think there's some real gems in there that I think even God himself seems to be alluding to us exploring. So, why close that off? And it could bring someone into the fold of Islam. So, I think it could be, hopefully, inshallah, it would be useful. So, anything good that I've said is from God. Any mistakes I've made is from myself. So, thank you so much for having me, Paul. And
thank you very much for using your expertise and your training to such good effect to benefit the Ummah, so we can have a sober, measured, but real appreciation, nevertheless, of the mathematical, remarkable signs, ayats in the Quran, which indicate a divine mind behind it, as there is in the universe itself, which is also an ayat, sign of God. There is in his word, the book of nature and the book of God, as is once put it, both pointing in the same direction to God himself. So I think you've done a really good job to do that. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Till next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Till next time. Wa alaikum salam.